Good morning, everyone. Oh, wow, it's loud.
Good morning, Nancy.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, let me have everybody wander in and take a seat. And let me, on behalf of the MTS community, welcome everybody here. Does this do? It is good to see some faces I haven't gotten to see in a while. Steve Parrish, talking to you. Lee Ramsey, talking to you. Dee Flood, talking to you. So welcome. We're glad you're here for the second of this year's Bowen lectures given by Dr. Marilyn Hudson. I have called this, I started to say we, I don't know that I should blame it on anybody else. I have called this sort of the last hurrah. In the sense of Dr. Hudson is retiring after 35 plus years at the end of this semester. I tried to get her to stay. It was as successful as getting Steve Parrish or Lee Ramsey to stay, as in it was not. But we are celebrating her time of service here. Dr. Hudson was the first woman to serve on the faculty at MTS. Being and if you have not had the experience, let me tell you that being first is hard. So she was 5 years on the faculty as the only woman here before I got here. And being second is much easier than being first. And so I remain very grateful to Dr. Hudson for that, and has served this community exceptionally well all these years, teaching all of the students watching online or in the room about preaching and about worship, which is the subject for today. I think our eagerness today is about the future. The other night looked at the recent past in terms of moments and movements in worship, and now talking about what the future might look like. I'm not sure she actually has a crystal ball, but thinking about that based on where we've been, because we all know, as she is using for her lectures, the times they are changing in lots and lots of ways. So we're glad to hear this today. The other night, I referred to Dr. Hudson as a sequoia in the forest that is MTS. That is true. She has stood with us, held out some of the wind and storms as they have gone through, withstood them, and enabled this forest to be deeply rooted and ever more lovely and ever more life-giving. I will be forever grateful for her friendship, for her contributions, and to moments like this. And dadgummit, I can't even make myself say something snarky. So, Marilyn, we are glad for so many, many, many things, and for this particular time today. So.
To Memphis Theological Seminary, and especially the faculty here who voted to let me do this. I am deeply grateful. And for you that are here in person today, thank you for your support. I feel it very deeply. And also to those of you that are tuned in via online streaming, I understand that those who were with me on Monday night saw mostly the top of my head, but my hair is really my best physical feature. I'll try to do a little better today. We'll see. In my lecture Monday night, I addressed the changing world of worship by highlighting 3 movements that changed the practice of worship across the landscape of churches in North America. Each movement had its own unique relationship to the postmodern culture that was changing around it. As the postmodern epoch freed society from the prevailing paradigms that privileged one gender, race, or class over others, The pluralism, relativism, and secularism that ensued exposed further questions about what it meant to be human in the world, not to mention what it means to be human in relation to God. Competing ideologies clamored for our endorsement. And as the institutions of leisure, buying and selling, and corporate bureaucracies grew larger, they were quick to harness the power of information and communication technologies, flooding the world with media-produced images and sound bites that overwhelmed the American culture, leaving humans more psychologically and socially fragmented, excluded, secluded, and alienated from communities of human intimacy. So today, we humans are more connected than ever through cyberspace, but we are also more physically isolated from personal interaction with others, and thus from ourselves. In the last 50 years, liturgical churches adopted a style of worship that's pretty much standardized liturgical practices for mainline Protestant churches. But in a society where reading, interpretation, and logical discourse has been displaced by tweets, the deeper meaning of liturgical worship has lost much of its power for many participants, and the sacraments seem drained of their enchantment. Congregational singing, accompanied by the bellows of a pipe organ, has found itself in fierce competition with the digitized sounds of contemporary worship music dancing through the airwaves. Its future has not yet been decided, but it seems that liturgical worship needs to be revitalized if it is to remain relevant to the postmodern world. Afro-Pentecostal worship, with its embrace of gospel music and gifts of the Spirit, is now the choice of many, if not most, Black churches in the United States. Gospel music brings together the many musical forms of the broader Black culture in America in a way that feels and sounds uniquely theirs. Gospel music, first embraced by early Afro-Pentecostal churches, celebrates improvisation as a sign of the freedom of divine presence, setting the example for other expressions of spiritual ecstasy in the service. And the spontaneous experience, whether as a shout, a dance, or a new way of singing a familiar song, signals authenticity in the worship of God that endorses and encourages an encounter with the Holy Spirit that is immediate, emotional, and usually individual. Participants in this style of worship may, as they become caught up in the emotional intensity of the music and preaching, experience a phenomenon called communitas, where persons find themselves in a liminal moment where barriers of class, race, gender, and other differences collapse into an intense feeling of intimacy and belonging to God and community. The Afro-Pentecostal style, which provides a sense of comfort, relief, and belonging to people who are oppressed, anxious, and unfulfilled, has been a haven to people experiencing the fragmentation of their social world. But what has been a cultivated experience of belonging may now be in danger of slipping toward irrelevance in a segmented world that offers numerous different experiential options. Contemporary Christian worship, arising out of the Jesus movement of the 70s, was built upon a counter-traditional impulse to reduce the practice of worship to singing new music that reflects the experiences of worship in an emerging culture. The affective nature of the music moved the worshipers emotionally into an individual encounter with God, much like Afro-Pentecostalism, but through a feeling of meeting God with the intimacy that one would bring to a romantic relationship. With the advent of communication technologies, the church hierarchy no longer controlled the hymnody of congregations. Songs could be projected on screens. And with the creation of CCLI, the licensing organization, the problem of getting copyright permission to use someone's material was solved. As the music of the culture became more sophisticated in its production and mixing, so did the music of contemporary worship. The addition of video cameras intensified this intimacy between participants and worship leaders, and further morphed this form of worship into a stage production where the worship leader assumes the elevated role of spiritual celebrity, as does the pastor of a congregation, a model that's familiar to people living in a culture of entertainment. With $1 billion industry, recording industry, supporting, promoting the continuous creation and consumption of this kind of music, contemporary Christian worship continues to spread throughout the churches in the United States. Its mastery of the use of new technologies in worship makes its style most compatible with the prevailing culture. Only the fatal flaws of its celebrity leaders have reduced its popularity or effectiveness among some of its followers. And as I said last night, these three worship styles do not cover all the ways that Christians practice their faith together. They're highlighted because of their pervasive influence on churches today. Today, I want to question the relevance of these styles for the future of our unstable society and imagine a different approach to worship for our uncertain future. But first, we can't forget COVID-19. In the March of 2020, the pandemic didn't just change the society, it changed the church as well. The plague of COVID, in many ways, intensified all the fragmentation and isolation of postmodern culture that we had known prior to it. But it also unmasked prejudice and injustice and oppression in unmistakable ways. Americans were not prepared for COVID-19. Science had not protected us from this deadly virus. The healthcare system was inadequate to meet the desperate needs of our neighbors. A disproportionate number of Black and brown people perished from lack of care, resources, and pre-existing diseases. The distrust of bureaucratic pronouncements left many of us highly vulnerable to disease and death, as autonomous individualism protested the call for everyone to be vaccinated. The human beings in physical isolation from their normal life began to awaken to their own mortality and limitations. People we loved and valued died painful deaths. The COVID pandemic became a pivotal moment for the world and the church. For the most part, I would say churches were not prepared for the isolation and distancing of the pandemic. After all, worship life of most congregations was about creating community, baptism, communion, passing the peace. Congregational singing, even corporate prayers presupposed a community where humans were in close proximity to one another, touching, sharing experiences, blending sounds. But then came Zoom. The technologies originally created for business, global communications, and even the entertainment industry became the lifeline of communities of faith as well. If your congregation was young enough, big enough, and skilled enough to figure out how to use it, you had a chance to tenuously cling to your community. Thank God for the manna of technology during the wilderness of COVID. Let's face it, planning, producing, transmitting, and watching worship on a screen is not easy or fun. Not only did clergy have to master technology, they had to preach to empty pews, and they had to rethink their appearance on a screen. Musicians could risk solos in person, but the spread of germs from choir singers was deadly. And with some effort, churches made the leap to blending individual voices into some kind of coherent whole through pre-recordings that were mixed and produced. But Zoom decimated congregational singing. It destroyed communal prayers and litanies. And there is nothing more artificial than a Zoom communion. However, we discovered a new benefit from online worship. People in isolation from one another tuned in. The longing for intimacy, the need for connection to other people intensified. And seeing other people's faces at a distance, and in some cases from a long distance, reminded us that we still belong to each other, even when we were apart. People hundreds of miles away logged into the church that they had once attended. Others who were curious about worship in places where they had never set foot could watch. It was safe to tune in from home in your pajamas as an observer to see if you felt a sense of connection to this group of strangers. The longing for community changed our practices and priorities during that time. But at the same time, almost 33% of all churches in North America just gave up meeting. People stopped worshiping, and some of them never started back. In preparing for this lecture, I read all kinds of studies about how the lives of human beings have changed since this tragic plague interrupted American life. I wish I had enough time to talk about all those changes, but I don't. I will only highlight a few statistics from an article that Dr. Gatke sent around recently. The study released in January of this year by the Survey Center on American Life at the American Enterprise Institute revealed that religious identity didn't change because of the pandemic. People still identified as religious. But before the pandemic, 75% of Americans reported attending religious services at least once a year, and 26% of them attended regularly. By the spring of 2022, only 66% reported attending religious services at least once a year. And the number attending worship decreased during that time. The number never attending worship increased during that time. And the group that quit attending worship during this time included a high number of people who identified themselves as ideologically liberal, persons who were never married, and those in the 18 to 29 age range. Some think that a pandemic would spark greater interest in religion. Of those surveyed, however, only 11% showed some increase in worship attendance, while 22% indicated less attendance than before. The analysis of this data on church attendance and religious identity showed that Rather than completely upending established patterns, the pandemic just accelerated the trends that were already happening in religious culture. The decline of religious attendance and the stability of religious identity over the past 2 years suggests that a person who identifies as Christian is less likely to engage in Christian practices like worship attendance that reflect the theological meanings of that faith. As the analysts concluded, the gap may signal an increase in cultural religiosity, where identity is linked to ethnic or cultural aspects of the tradition rather than specific religious beliefs or rituals. And in another study, Springtime Research Institute surveyed over 10,000 young people between the ages of 13 and 25 in the United States after the advent of COVID-19. Nearly 1 in 5 young people said they lost the practice of attending religious or spiritual services during the pandemic, though half say they watched at least one service online. Only 13% said they found any joy or hope in these services, and only 12% said they hope virtual services never continue after the pandemic. The study found that youth and young adults care deeply about human rights and environmental justice, and they also at the same time believe that the church's concern for these things is significantly less than theirs. They indicated that they felt uncertain, uncomfortable, stressed, and often traumatized in the post-pandemic culture, but that they do not identify with the religious leaders in their churches, or they feel like they belong to their religious communities, and they don't relate to their practices or beliefs. Many of them are discovering other ways other than religion to flourish, but they are making very few or permanent commitments to churches or groups that might lead the church to grow now or in the future. Phew. You may feel some deep anxiety about this decline in religious interest practice in the United States. Or perhaps you think of it more like Barbara Brown Taylor once said, as a weight loss chart for the church. However, you should feel the lack of connection that young people feel to the church today is alarming. It was interesting to me that besides the religious surveys, the Pew Foundation surveyed adults, and 35% of them said that after the pandemic, they felt that social gatherings of any kind had become less important to them than before the onset of the pandemic. In-person social interaction began to decrease during the early 2000s, but the pandemic fueled a sharp shift to online spaces. So there are now small communities on platforms like, and I had never heard of this, Discord. And you go to the homepage, it says, imagine a place where you can belong to a social club, a gaming group, or a worldwide art community, where just you and a handful of friends can spend time together, a place that makes it easy to talk every day and hang out more often. So this Discord is a platform with voice, video, and text chat. And 90% of the communities on it have 15 people or less. The small communities reflect a kind of desire for more localized and intimate interactions, even if people don't actually know each other in person. Reddit and Facebook groups also provide access to these kind of small group experiences. The world of worship during COVID changed, but are the changes permanent or temporary? Thank God the shortage of toilet paper during the pandemic was short-lived. But a lot of these changes in church attendance and public perception of the value of worship reflects just a continuation of the decline that began decades ago. It's not a temporary change. So what does the future look like? Well, when I began my research for this lecture, I consulted many futurist writers. I wanted to see what their version of the future looked like, to find out what they thought the next chapter might be. And that's when I discovered the work of Yuval Noah Harari. I've mentioned him before. He's an Israeli historian, philosopher, and author. As a follow-up to his previous works on the human past and the human future, Harari wrote a book in 2018 called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And in that book, he says that there are 3 things in the present moment that will require a response from us in the future. And I quote, "The looming ecological crisis, the growing threat of weapons of mass destruction, and the rise of new disruptive technologies. Perhaps most important, artificial intelligence and biotechnology that are merging are giving humanity the power to reshape and re-engineer life." He admits that not even he can predict what the year 2050 will look like because of how rapidly everything is changing now. But his concern for these 3 changes are real. First, as other scholars have reminded us, we are living in the Anthropocene epoch, the most recent period in Earth's lengthy history, when human activity started to have a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. The intensity of climate change is felt in the intensification of natural disasters, of tornadoes like recently experienced in Mississippi, hurricanes, floods, extreme temperatures, wildfires, and the swift melting of glacial ice. The conditions of chronic drought threaten food production and the available drinking water in many locations around the globe. Extreme conditions will soon threaten human safety in locations that will lead to the advance of people looking for a place to call home. And the most economically deprived people will be, as usual, the most vulnerable to the rising tides and rising temperatures. Plants and animals are endangered. We need to be looking ahead at the impending needs of the most vulnerable rather than debating whether or not climate change is real. Change is coming, whether we're prepared for it or not. And warfare still threatens to destroy humanity and our planet. Of course, he wrote this before Putin decided to invade the Ukraine. But the sophistication of existing weapons now give people the power to indiscriminately deprive, starve, and kill massive numbers of people. And at this point, the threat of nuclear weapons in the arsenals of multiple regimes now makes the work of educating the world in the ways of peace with justice more urgent than ever before. Peace must be sought through faith in human compassion and the hard work of building interhuman communities of cooperation. Otherwise, we all just remain complicit in the destruction of the human family, both here and around the globe. And most of us rarely, if ever, spend our days thinking about the scientists, corporations, and governments that are, as Harari puts it, learning to hack the human brain to find out what motivates human decisions. As big data grows even bigger each day, it's possible that the algorithms discovered in this data can create something akin to a digital dictatorship in which the power is concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite, while most people suffer not just from exploitation, but as Harari puts it, something far worse, irrelevance. People are already being confronted with layoffs as computers take over the work that people have been doing for centuries. People are going to have to make decisions about how the meaning of life is defined in their lives, because this power will challenge it. Who better than the Christian community to defy the trend toward human irrelevance by enlivening a practice of forgiveness and hope made visible in acts of Christian worship? In recent decades, the work of theology here and in other schools in the United States has shifted away from building systematic and doctrinal formations about the nature of God and moved toward the exploration of ethical engagement of the Christian life. Faith is being redefined as something we live, not simply something we accept as true. Discipleship means following Jesus into engagement with the world that reveals the true nature of God's shalom. And this is today's work for people of faith that has the potential to address a struggling humanity that Harari sees in a changing culture. So for a brief moment, let's just ask ourselves, do these three models of worship offer hope to this vision of the future? I think that contemporary worship that invests in the latest technologies and is supported by the music industry will be sustained, at least for a while, because there's such an abundance of resources that are available for it. And the culture of buying and selling also supports and encourages engagement with this style of worship. But will people in these communities find connection with small social groups or persons, or will they go online to find them, to look for intimacy and interhuman experience? I don't know. Afro-Pentecostalism. Statistics show that worship attendance in Black churches is declining. Not at the same rate as mainline white Protestant churches, but it's still declining. People of African descent in the United States once shared an identity forged in the experience of a common history and a common culture that was curated through the Black church. But with the rise of individualism in our culture and the separation of persons from their cultural roots, will persons of African descent still look to Black churches as the source of their identity and hope for their future? Does the cultural ethos that shaped the congregational experience of Afro-Pentecostalism still embody that same level of safety, intimacy, and unconditional acceptance that it once did? I don't know. Some Black churches I know have shifted because they have financial resources to acquire cameras and screens and microphones and sophisticated musical instruments. And so rather than the style of planned spontaneity of Afro-Pentecostalism, worship is much more planned, choreographed, and performed as a stage production. It resembles much more contemporary Christian worship than Afro-Pentecostalism. This resemblance to contemporary entertainment production makes worship feel relevant to people who are used to living in a culture of entertainment. But can it be sustained? Is there, like in the entertainment industry, a demand to constantly maintain a high level of professionalism in these services that will drive the church? And finally, liturgical worship. Long-held traditions of liturgical worship will most likely continue, but in the shadow of its lingering tradition. Some folks will continue to enact the liturgy with devotion to its connection to an earlier time and culture. Others might find solace in ancient words and symbols and rituals that were created to convey a mystery surrounding the still lingering world in which we live. But does it have the same relevance? A woman on the faculty at Yale Divinity School told the story of when she was a campus minister in England. No one was coming to the services. Nobody set foot in the chapel. So she decided she would open the doors of the old stained glass Gothic building at night and invited students to come in and lie on the floor in the dark, in silence, looking up at the walls and the ceiling and the lights around them. Without words of explanation, she just let the objects around them evoke their own meaning for the students in the moment. And after several weeks of this, students began to express a new interest in spiritual things. But an imposed liturgy was not one of them. I talked Monday night about First Congregational with its evolution into what I now call a mashup liturgy. It celebrates the plurality of God's creation. They took the liberty to pick and choose elements that spoke to the congregational context and added new elements as theological commitments of the church evolved and changed. So the church originally followed a high liturgical style of worship, but the congregation gradually made changes to reflect their transformation to become an open and affirming congregation, devoted to just peace, and adopting anti-racist commitments. The context for worship changed as they moved to this huge auditorium that they renovated to suit their needs as they gathered in varieties of forms. And with clear windows that let in lots of light, they brought in plants and trees from the natural world. The form of worship they have adopted is liturgical, but with a creative blend of elements that represent a lively pluralism that could be characterized as mashup worship. The culture, our culture, values mashup. We see it in art and clothing and literature and especially music. So why not worship? It's a consumer culture we live in. Why not pick and choose what works for us? It's an option. but without major effort to translate the meaning of theological words and rituals into meanings that are not just accessible, but relevant to the concerns of young people today, I can't help think, but that membership will decline more and more. So in light of that, as I bring this lecture to a close, I want to share with you a vision. It's an interesting dream. It's an imagined possibility of what relevant worship might look like for a post-human world. That's what we're talking about when artificial intelligence determines the meaning of everything. It's a world that no longer values human life as bearing the image of God, but it's a world that reduces human identity to shared data and endless consumption. So as I listen to Yuval Noah Harari express concerns for a rapidly changing future in the United States and globally, I hear from him a call to a new kind of authenticity, one that's not expressed in rational arguments or in the acquisition of knowledge and skills, not expressed in moments of emotional bliss, but expressed in embodied presence with one another. I hear him call people away from their screens and back into their physical bodies, undistracted by the competing claims of the culture. I hear a call for faith, the faith community, to help fragmented lives heal through human interaction that explores what it means to be human in a post-human world. So here it is. What if the church reached back beyond those earliest church documents, reached back to retrieve three precious gifts: water, bread, and wine? These are basic elements of earthly life from a planet in peril, and they are sacred. As elements of life, they are perfectly open signs. They call forth the truth that we carry in our bodies. They are essential for life. But as an open sign, they can call us to a new awareness of identities connected to other realities as well. They can link us to a story of Jesus of Nazareth, who called people to let him show them the way to life. And somehow, throughout the centuries of change, God has continued to show up in these sacred elements to give life to a broken world. My good friend, Dr. Miner, does a beautiful job of explaining the meaning of the kingdom of God by describing it as a household. God's renewed social world. What if the household of God became the metaphorical model for Christian faith and identity? What if worship was understood to be the genuine practice of hospitality by the household in service to God? What might that look like? Well, first, I think this form of worship would have water, clear, clean water for drinking, for washing, even bathing. Everyone would find the water they need to maintain life and health. When a community values the gift of water, they will protect and defend the sanctity of that water on the earth in local communities and around the globe, not hoard it for themselves, but ensure that people have access to this essential element of life. Second, this worship would have a table. This table would seat up to 5 to 8 people, enough to share a meal, but not so many to prevent everyone from hearing and speaking with one another. A glass of clear water would be set at each place. One person would serve as host of the meal, preparing and serving food, selecting a story from the Bible to tell, and leading conversation around how people at the table find meaning in it for their own identity. People would listen and speak with the kind of care that brings others to voice, with a level of intimacy that is comfortable and safe. Bread would be broken and shared. Juice and wine would be poured and shared together, a sign of connection among family. Moments of mindfulness would help reunite people's minds with their bodies as they savor the flavors and sensations of an embodied life. A moment of silent mindfulness as each person feels the cool wetness of clear water flow into their bodies. Another moment of mindfulness as portions of food are tasted and chewed and swallowed. And after a nutritious meal is eaten, people will share stories, poems, artwork, songs, or compositions that express the meaning of being fully human. And at the end of the meal, a prayer of thanksgiving is offered and the peace is passed. Food for the meal could come from gardens cultivated by church members near the church house to be used for worship and shared with neighbors. Sustainable methods will be used for cultivating food, and the community will commit to limit the amount of waste produced. The church building is no longer a monument to God, but a refuge for strangers, a place to launder clothing and find quietness and a little rest. The sanctuary is a dining hall with tables for small group worship. And the kitchen is now a sacristy for preparing the sacred elements of the service. And finally, a porch or patio gives people space to breathe and sing, dance, or laugh together. Those other unused spaces might be studios for humans to express the meaning of their lives through art, or a refuge for a stranger. The key to this practice of worship is that it continues beyond the walls of a common neighborhood building. You see, tables are portable. So is water, wine, and bread. Anyone who sits together with family at table is capable of serving as a host and knows how to lead when it is their turn. Wherever there is suffering, a table is set. Whenever tragedy stifles voices with grief, the church brings water, wine, and bread. And where people cry out for justice, the church hauls out the table and chairs and invites strangers to sit and receive the gifts of life. The source of life is worshiped and glorified as people are nourished and valued as brothers and sisters in the human family of the Creator. And the risen Christ is alive in the moments of life renewed. And the Spirit breathes life each time that we discover that we are beloved beings of flesh and blood. What does that say about theological education? Might look a little different. Like a course on helping people find their inner Mary and Martha. Might have need to learn skills for setting a warm and inviting table. Courses on gardening, environmental care, home renovation. Storytelling might be popular for Christian leaders. And even learning a foreign language might help break through those interhuman barriers. Let's just say the curriculum would be down to earth. Well, it's both exciting and challenging to dream theological dreams about God's future. But friends, now more than ever, our world needs those of us who care about the planet, the displaced strangers among us, and a generation of young people losing hope in their uncertain future. It's time. It's time to do the challenging work of dreaming dreams and seeing visions, not on screens, but in the imaginations of our hearts, infused by God's own Spirit with love. Amen.
If y'all would ask any questions, you need to sit down. I don't know anybody that deserves that any more than Mary Lynn does, so thank you for that. So we're past 12, so I'm not going to offer a ton of time. But if anyone has a few questions for us to jump into, and with Dr. Hudson, let's do it. Okay. So he comes down here. Wait, go ahead.
I spent quite a bit of time doing a really good job of covering the impact of COVID, which I think most of us in this room felt. You articulated it extremely well. And this is beyond the scope of what you're doing, but have you had any thoughts about how much the church might have been weakened prior to COVID by the political right, evangelical tendencies that I don't really see, as somebody that does church history, really weakening kind of U.S. interest in the church, because evangelical Christianity had become something that totally wasn't a decade or two before. Do you think that had a major impact on the decline that really took hold during COVID?
Mm-hmm. I tried to avoid too many political arguments in my lecture, but yeah, we are retiring. It helps. It's very true. I think what I would say is that the political and social chaos that occurred, I'm going to say chaos beginning in 2016, had already started prior to that, and it would not have occurred if the culture had not already shifted prior to that time. So it was a symptom of postmodern culture. And I think the irrelevance of the church had already begun because the church too easily was fractured by ideological differences of people, which is a symptom of the irrelevance and failure of both our practices and our theologies. as churches. So I would say that. Do you agree with that, Ron?
Yeah, I think so.
Mhm. Yeah.
On the eve of your retirement, I ask, what are your practical steps moving forward with your vision of this new church?
You know, it's a dream. And what dreams take work to bring into reality. But this work of preparing and thinking about the future has inspired me. So as Lee Ramsey sitting there, as he and I were talking before this, my first year will be decompression and reimagining myself. But I have a feeling that the way that God works in my life, God will put things in my path that will compel me to engage. And so we'll see what happens. It'll be an adventure.
I can say you've spoken to some of my own personal crises in this time with my own future, and especially in talks of disaffiliation from the United Methodist Church. There is a change in my church now disaffiliates that I'll have nothing.
Right.
So not only do I look forward to the future of maybe being creative, but the thoughts that I've had on what happens if everything falls out line up with what you're saying. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Elaine, go ahead. How do you make sense of churches that are doing really well? And I'm thinking about St. Michael's on Summer Avenue, which is a Catholic church. You were talking about Protestants, but how do you make sense of churches that are first in their cities, whether it's here or in Africa or Asia?
Mhm. Good question, Eileen. How do we make sense of people, churches that are doing well in this day and age? I'm going to suggest that they are already in the process of doing the work of hospitality. That many of these churches that are successful are reaching people who are most vulnerable. And in their vulnerability, their defenses are down and they have much more of an ability to engage in the interhuman because they have a safe place to do it. So that may not be true for all churches, but I still see that as a principle at the heart of Christian faith that can build human community that is a thriving community.
Good answer.
Thanks.
It's a related question to both of the two previous questions, which is preface it by a kind of an assumption that our dreams come out of our experiences. And so I'm wondering what you're already seeing among churches or among people of faith that you might already be experiencing that dream.
There are practices being done at different churches. Certainly, I think Manna House is a practice of Christian faith and worship in its own right. There are other churches that are having moments just to foster interhuman communication between people because people don't have that in their everyday lives anymore. And some churches really focus on using art as a means of people to get in touch with their sense of identity and self in relation to others and God. Those are not specific examples, but when I started having this vision, if you will, it took me to the tables of my friends, that it is around the tables of my family and friends that I experience God, because it is there that I am permitted to be as fully alive as possible.
I was gonna stop it, but at least I said
Yeah.
it.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you for, the thought work and the hard work and the love that went into all of this. It's a gift to us to hear your vision kind of rolling out there. So thank you. As you get ready to leave, thank you for what you're leaving with the whole community. I did want to hear you say, because of it being so much a part of your life and your love, how you envision music fitting into this vision.
I think certainly, people, that I hear music arising from the experiences of people. There are also some other communities that are producing music that might resonate with our experience that could be borrowed. But I don't think sitting around the table or on the porch singing is a bad thing, especially if you start to harmonize. I think it's really life affirming. I just hear that kind of spontaneous approach to singing happening. And, because it bubbles up in me, that would be something that I'd have to share. I love that y'all have questions and everything. I wish we had lots more time, but we don't.
Yeah, I've got 12:17, so we're a little past, so I'm gonna take this opportunity to say, y'all can catch or ask your question again. And thank you all on behalf of MTS and behalf of Hudson for your presence here. And join me one more time in expressing